Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is Gene Sharp's conceptual framework from dictatorship to democracy. This is a text that, it fundamentally challenged the assumption that military force is the only way to achieve political liberation. Sharp didn't just advocate for nonviolence, he sort of reverse-engineered dictatorship, giving activists a really essential, detailed playbook for dismantling these entrenched, oppressive regimes.
And his influences, well, it's undeniable. But while we have to recognize Sharp's immense contribution to resistance theory, the central question we're grappling with today is a critical one. Is nonviolent political defiance inherently the most viable and strategically effective way to dismantle a dictatorship and establish a durable democracy? Or does this framework, for all its sophistication, place demands on an oppressed population, in terms of strategic genius and absolute discipline, that are just often impossible to meet in the heat of conflict?
I'm going to argue that political defiance is strategically and structurally superior. It's really the only method that targets the regime's political power right at its source, making its disintegration, inevitable if the methods are applied with careful strategic thinking.
And I'm going to challenge that idea of inevitability. I contend that the framework, by demanding near-perfect operational execution and, adherence to this strict nonviolent discipline under immense duress, it possesses an inherent strategic fragility that often makes success elusive or the resulting cost just prohibitively high.
My perspective is really rooted in Sharp's profound analysis of power. Dictatorships, he posits, are not these self-sustaining fortresses. They're political constructs, and they are entirely reliant on the obedience and cooperation of the people they govern. So by choosing political defiance, the resistance completely avoids the conventional battlefield, the military arena, where, let's be honest, oppressors almost always have an overwhelming superiority.
This is the premise illustrated by the monkey master fable in the text, isn't it? The idea that the tyrant only remains in power because the subjects continue to feed him.
Exactly. The perceived strength of the dictator is, at its core, illusory. Dictatorial power flows from 6 necessary channels. You have authority, human resources, skills and knowledge, intangible factors like a sense of legitimacy, material resources, and of course, the means to enforce sanctions. Political defiance is uniquely engineered to restrict or sever all of these sources, often simultaneously. You use economic non-cooperation, political non-cooperation, social protest, all to cause what Sharp calls political starvation. We saw this succeed in forcing the collapse of regimes in the Philippines in the 80s, and of course the Eastern Bloc in 1989. And this method leads to a durable democracy because the power shift happens horizontally across society, strengthening those civil institutions, unions, churches, community groups, so the population itself becomes resistant to future tyranny.
I acknowledge that theoretical elegance. I do. But I come at it from a different angle, viability. The conceptual framework requires, highly sophisticated long-term strategic planning, a grand strategy broken down into focused campaigns, tactics, and methods. And Sharp himself, right there in the material, offers a pretty sobering assessment of the operational reality. He notes that resistance leaders are often constantly harassed and overwhelmed by immediate responsibilities. This expectation of achieving the required level of complex, long-term planning under that kind of duress, it introduces a massive practical hurdle that I think proponents often gloss over.
Okay, but that's a challenge to execution, right? It's not a flaw in the strategy itself. The technique provides the intellectual tools needed precisely to overcome those planning hurdles.
I would disagree, because the means of struggle itself carries what I see as a fatal systemic vulnerability: the maintenance of strict nonviolent discipline. Sharp is extremely clear on this. Even limited resistance violence during a campaign can be, quote, counterproductive. And why? Because it immediately shifts the contest back to that military arena, where the dictators have that overwhelming advantage we just talked about. This requirement for an entire population to maintain perfect, coordinated non-cooperation, even when they're facing execution and intense provocation, it places an unsustainable pressure on them and makes the entire grand strategy incredibly unforgiving. A single emotionally driven act of frustration could compromise the whole effort.
I see why you emphasize discipline as a vulnerability, but let me offer a different perspective. nonviolent discipline isn't an unreasonable burden, it's the cost of strategic advantage. The genius of Sharpe's approach is that it provides, 198 distinct methods, an extensive menu of actions categorized as protest, non-cooperation, and intervention. So if a few people do resort to violence, the vast majority can still employ things like economic boycotts or political non-cooperation to starve the regime of its resources. The sheer diversity of methods allows for a tactical resilience that, military approaches just don't have. You can't fight an army with a kitchen knife, but you can dismantle its logistics and its legitimacy using 1,000 tiny acts of refusal.
But the problem isn't the number of methods, it's the psychological impact of state repression. Repression is specifically designed to target the population's fear and to provoke a violent response. Sharpe himself identifies fear as the primary hurdle. When the population, fueled by hatred and despair, sees even limited retaliation, it validates the dictator's narrative that this is a civil war, not a moral struggle. And crucially, it gives the regime the justification for massive, overwhelming counterviolence. We are demanding that people facing immediate, brutal violence maintain, quote, high standards of behavior. This is not just difficult, it's a strategic requirement so high that the majority of historic resistance campaigns have failed to meet it. And that brings us right back to strategic calculation.
Sharpe insists that strategists calculate a sequenced plan leading to one of the four mechanisms of change: conversion, accommodation, nonviolent coercion, or disintegration. But, for listeners who might not be steeped in this framework, we should probably clarify, what is the difference between, say, accommodation and coercion? And how can leaders possibly know which one they're aiming for when they start a campaign?
That's an important point for clarity. So conversion is the rarest mechanism where the opponents genuinely change their beliefs. Accommodation is more common. The opponent keeps their views, but concedes ground to the resistors because they fear the damage from continued non-cooperation. Nonviolent coercion happens when the regime is so paralyzed by mass non-cooperation, its sources of power are entirely cut off, that it literally cannot execute its policies and is forced to comply against its will. And disintegration, well, that's the final stage, where the regime simply collapses because its essential systems just cease to function.
Right, thank you. That distinction is crucial. But this is exactly where the framework's ambition meets its operational reality. If resistance leaders miscalculate which mechanism is actually achievable at a given moment, say, aiming for disintegration when only accommodation is possible, they overextend their resources, they suffer maximum casualties, and they could fail entirely. The material notes that resistance movements often just react defensively or rely on these emotional bright ideas. How can movements possibly guarantee the informed creativity needed to select the correct mechanism and calculate a phased series of campaigns years in advance, all while operating under a state of constant threat?
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on it. The difficulty of strategic planning doesn't invalidate the technique, it just asserts that competence is required for success. Sharpe gives us the intellectual roadmap precisely to ensure leaders stop relying on bright ideas and start engaging in careful, strategic thinking. The solution to chaos isn't to avoid strategy, it's to embrace it. Strategists must calculate a phased series of campaigns to gain limited objectives. Sharpe calls this selective resistance. These small, incremental victories strengthen the opposition, they educate the population, and they weaken the dictatorship's grip, making that eventual mass defiance manageable. Without this calculated approach, any struggle, violent or nonviolent, is doomed. The goal is self-reliance, built through skill and phased practice.
But that assumes the regime is static. Let's inject a modern challenge into this, one that Sharpe didn't really face when he was drafting the blueprint: digital authoritarianism. Sharpe's framework relies heavily on a mass organization, on coordinated communication, and on visibility. Today, regimes have access to ubiquitous digital surveillance, mass data analysis, sophisticated tools to track, target, and neutralize leaders before they even begin their first campaign of selective resistance. The state can shut down all independent communication channels in an instant. Does the framework really account for this new layer of essentially intangible repression that targets the very organizational structure Sharpe depends on?
That is a legitimate new source of friction, absolutely. But it fundamentally requires the same solution. A digital tool is just a new means of coercion or resource control. The resistance simply adapts nonviolent non-cooperation to the digital space. If the state uses ubiquitous surveillance, the resistance has to engage in decentralized, clandestine, or distributed forms of digital non-cooperation intervention, things like digital boycotts or intentionally flooding state surveillance channels with noise. The regime still needs skilled workers to maintain that digital infrastructure. If those human resources refuse, the system fails. The principle remains robust. You remove the pillars of power, and the dictatorship will fall. And the superiority of political defiance is perhaps most evident not in the battle itself, but in the aftermath, the transition phase. Because the power shift occurs throughout civil society, strengthening those independent institutions. The groundwork for a durable democracy is laid right from the start. We're not just replacing a dictator with a new general. Sharp provides explicit methods for blocking coups by immediately denying legitimacy to the pushists and deploying mass non-cooperation against them. This self-defense capability is inherent in the method of struggle itself, a capability that is completely absent if liberation relied on a military coup.
I come at it from a different way regarding the transition. While the intention to install a durable democracy is laudable, the chaos that follows a state collapse is immense and, frankly, potentially fatal to democratic hopes. You're correct that the strategy requires subverting the loyalty of the military, police, and civil servants. But the text itself warns against asking police or soldiers to immediately mutiny because of the extreme danger of execution. So, if the collapse is sudden, like in those weeks-long examples that are often cited, the opposition finds itself with a partial victory. The central regime is gone, but the enforcement groups are only partially loyal or highly factionalized. In this power vacuum, the danger of a coup staged by groups who merely appear reform-minded is acute. These figures promise to restore order and end the disruption. So, while the conceptual tools to block a coup exist, the lack of reliable, unified control over the armed enforcement apparatus during those decisive, chaotic moments makes the new system highly vulnerable. The system demands perfect, rapid implementation of transition plans in an environment that is by its very nature designed to be disordered.
The fragility you're describing, though, it merely highlights the need for continued organized action. The entire premise of Sharp's work is that the moment the dictatorship falls is not the moment the struggle ends. It's when the final campaign begins, the campaign to install and defend democracy. By relying on the technique of political defiance, the population is already mobilized, it's educated, and it's prepared to non-cooperate with any new threat, whether that threat comes from the old guard or from new pretenders. The very act of achieving freedom using this methodology hardens the society against future tyranny.
That's the hope, yes. But the success stories you cite are often the exceptions that prove the rule regarding the difficulty. The framework demands an extraordinary, and I would say perhaps elusive, level of unity, discipline, and strategic genius from an oppressed population that is under continuous, violent fire. Sharp provides the necessary vocabulary and framework for freedom, but we have to be realistic about the immense sustained operational cost that's required to convert this brilliant strategic theory into practice without incurring catastrophic failure.
Political defiance remains the only rational choice. It's a self-reliant strategy that utilizes the profound truth that dictatorial power ultimately depends on the governed. Strategic planning converts this philosophical understanding into actionable campaigns, offering the most structurally sound path not just to liberation, but to a durable, self-defending, democratic foundation.
We agree that Sharp's blueprint is essential, but the demands placed on the oppressed population by this framework, particularly the need for unflinching discipline in the face of provocation, and the requirement for highly sophisticated long-term strategic calculation amidst chaos, force us to continuously measure the operational feasibility against the immense theoretical promise.
And I think this discussion really illuminates that core tension inherent in Sharp's work, the elegance of the theory, set against the punishing difficulty of its execution in the real world.
Indeed, there remains so much more to explore in the material regarding how movements today, especially facing modern surveillance and intense repression, might best bridge that gap between strategic concept and successful street-level practice.